Good? You can hear me? Okay. Great. Well, good afternoon, everybody. I really am happy to welcome you to this Economist Impact session on energy transition and fragility at COP28. My name is Phillip Cornell. I am the global practice lead for energy and sustainability at Economist Impact. Who's Economist Impact? You might have known us from our former name, the Economist Intelligence Unit. But basically, we provide evidence-based insights for policymakers, global institutions, businesses, and NGOs. And those that are tuning in can see our link to Economist Impact Sustainability Project, where we have a breadth of our work and access on key findings on issues like energy transition, resilience, circularity, ecosystems. We work closely with key institutions, including many that are represented on this stage, to support the transition to a more sustainable and equitable future. And because energy and sustainability is one of our core pillars, we're deeply concerned with how societies can cope with global trends like climate change, geopolitical fracture, and technological change. And that's why it's such a pleasure to be at COP28 today and have the chance to welcome and moderate such an esteemed panel on this topic of energy transition and fragility. And as world leaders meet here in Dubai to discuss pathways to transitioning to a low-carbon economy, conflict, weak governance, and distrust of institutions are really dominating the agenda in many countries and regions around the world. And while much attention is really rightly given to thinking about how to make the transition more just, what does that transition actually look like amidst conflict or where governance is otherwise limited? Renewable and distributed technologies are providing energy where central authorities cannot, and with it many other concurrent basic services. And that's proving to be key to enabling commerce and education and communications in zones of ongoing conflict, whether it be in Ukraine, Yemen, as well as in remote areas of sub-Saharan Africa, or where dysfunctional state institutions fail to operate. So how can fragile and weakly governed communities navigate the challenges and opportunities of transition? How does the resilient delivery of energy and associated services empower local communities, drive development, and orient political power? How will energy transition affect state legitimacy, and will it serve as a force for peace? So I'm really excited for the panel we have to discuss all of that. To my left, Ala Kasem is advisor to the president of Yemen and CEO of Deep Root Consulting. Angela Holmesy is CEO of Ignite Power, one of the premier providers of off-grid power in Africa and a recent winner of the Zayed Sustainability Prize. Anna Bierde is managing director of operations at the World Bank. Gautam Narishman is global lead on environment, energy, and disaster at UNICEF. And finally, Sergio Pimenta is vice president for the Africa region at the IFC. So welcome to all of you for joining us in this conversation today. Let me just kick off with a very basic question, which is, what does the delivery of basic energy services mean for the people that are living in these spaces? How does it affect their lives? And maybe, Angela, I'll turn to you, since you're working so closely.
Thank you for that question. Thank you for inviting me today. It's really a pleasure to be here, and that's a theme that is actually very, very close to my heart, because we do work across sub-Saharan Africa. We go into LDCs, into like and not just into LDCs, you know, like urban or suburban area, but we actually go very deep rural. We go to what we call the places that are the hardest to reach, and that's really what is our core focus as a mission and as a vision, and most of our operation are really deep rural in the countries where we operate. More importantly, why is it so close to my heart? I come from a conflict region. I was born in a war. I was born in a country that had electricity and actually lost it from corruption, from conflict, and a lot of things. So this theme is something that I really care about. And when we work at Ignite, we always say that what we do is about the people, obviously very deep social impact, which I will come in a second, the planet, around making sure that we provide clean solutions to the people that we're serving so that we support the next 2 billion people to get into a green growth path. But it is as well also a third P, and the third P is about prosperity. And it's about peace and prosperity, because those solutions are a game changer for providing solutions that will breed that type of societies. What does it mean for the people, the solution? It doesn't mean just having light or charging devices. Those two in themselves bring safety, the ability to do homework and learn and activities at night, brings as well the ability to have like more commerce or more like productive use activities because they have mobile phones and other things that they can charge. But it as well has very deep ripple effect in SDG 1, as well as in several other SDG around health and wellness, around education outcomes. So it's SDG 7 at the core of it, but there's probably like 13 SDGs or so that are directly impacted by having access to distributed infrastructure in those communities.
Great, thanks so much, Angela. And you mentioned things like education and health, and these are things that really touch children. So maybe Gautam, I can go to you next. Obviously children are some of the most affected and most vulnerable to these kinds of effects. So how do you see these kinds of services, the provision of energy, affecting the lives of children?
And I'm really happy that you asked the question the way that you did, because at UNICEF, this might limit my career, but we don't really care about energy. We work on it in over 80 countries because it means that mothers can give safer deliveries at night if you have a healthcare center that's powered by energy. It means that you can have a child who has a better chance of an education. It means that girls have to travel less distances for water and are less subjected to violence and exploitation because you have solar-powered water systems that are closer to their communities. So that's why we care about energy.
Great, thanks so much. And maybe just thinking about real-world cases, maybe I could ask you a little bit about what the situation is in a place like Yemen, where some of the basic government services have come to a standstill, and how are the people coping with that, and how is it affecting how they deal with the lack of energy, or get it?
Thank you very much for having me. I mean, Yemen, from the beginning, had limited access to electricity. Only 40% of the population had access to electricity. With the war, that number has decreased to only 15% who have access to electricity. And with that, there were lots of challenges in terms of powering health centers, powering education institutions, in terms of for people at households to be able to fulfill their own basic needs. Within the past few years, the path into energy transition has not necessarily been conscious in terms of moving into renewable, but it was out of necessity. So at the beginning, once the limited central capacity started to collapse, people switched into power generators using diesel to fuel their own electricity needs. But with the scarcity of fuel, that then posed another challenge for people, and they started to look at what are the alternatives, and what are those alternatives that are sustainable, that are not necessarily linked to fuel supply that is in a lot of cases marked with corruption, with high prices, with instability, and solar was one of those solutions. So we have seen from 2017 to 2019 an uptake of around 500 megawatt of solar energy that is provided through household kind of investments. But the challenge remains that a lot of people, for them, they need higher quality kind of solutions that let them trust in viability and sustainability of these solutions, not the low-cost kind of solutions, very low-cost solutions, very low quality. And that has been a challenge because of access to finance. A lot of people these investments, as small as they are, it's quite huge for their own personal investments. And we have had a number of projects that we have partnered with the World Bank, with the IFC on some of these things. Some of them actually was quite instrumental. We managed in one of the projects to supply 200,000 households with solar systems. And that's huge in a country that is in conflict. We have managed to provide 400 health facilities with solar systems and 800 education facilities. So you can see that it is making a difference, but there remain some challenges that we need to address. One of the challenges is there has been a perception that those countries in conflict only requires humanitarian aid. And development aid is not necessarily the priority, but that's not necessarily the case. And what we need to do, and that has been one of the challenges in terms of having access to those finances, to actually be able to get access to those kind of systems. The other thing is, we need, what we are fearing is there is now a change in terms of global policies towards fragile countries, and generally in terms of aid, that and this is one of the concerns that we have with the World Bank, is that they are going with the long-term kind of credit system. Countries like Yemen and other fragile countries cannot afford credit, even if it's long-term, even if it's facilitated, partly because those kind of credit systems require some legislation approval, and at times of war that becomes very difficult to achieve, and also because the fiscal the fiscal space that we have is very limited. So that's just some of the challenges that we are facing, and some of the issues and concerns that we are having.
Thanks so much, Ala. And I mean, I think it's only right just to go next to you, Anna. I mean, obviously we hear about the role that the World Bank plays. It's really important. But as Ala mentions, in the absence of sort of a government presence, that can be very difficult. So how do you overcome that, and how do we actually get this kind of investment on the ground in the absence of government presence?
Thank you so much, and great to be here. Great to be with this esteemed group on the panel. Well, first and foremost, I have to say access to energy is so important, and we still have so many countries around the world, particularly in Africa, but also other low-income countries where the access rate is unacceptably low. And I have to say, I've been in the World Bank for over 25 years. My technical career in the World Bank was in energy, and it really, for me, is just unacceptable when I visit countries where the access rate is, like in South Sudan, less than 10%, Central African Republic, less than 16%, here in Yemen drop back this way from even a rate that was too low to begin with, or visiting Malawi again after 20 plus years, and they have only moved up a couple of percentage points in their access, which tells me the conventional approach doesn't work. We have to go towards new technologies, and I'm super excited about solar for the reasons that we've already heard, number one. Number two, we see a situation where, unfortunately, the world is becoming more fragile. So we have to be prepared to work in fragile settings. Our studies show that by 2030, 60% of the extreme poor will be living in fragile and conflict settings. Number two, we have increased our commitments. Almost a quarter of all of our commitments every year go to countries that are fragile in conflict settings. So we have to figure out a way how to electrify these countries. We just have to figure it out. And thirdly, we can do it. It's not conventional, though. It's the new ways. And the new ways are definitely solar. Either solar parks, like we just did in Central African Republic, 25 megawatts with battery, mini grids, which I'm super excited to see, or distributed solutions like we're seeing, or even little solar kits that can make a difference because they can be used for lighting or charging your phone or making sure that vaccines can be cooled in a health clinic. So solar for me can suit so many different opportunities. And then you're right, in many places it's hard to work because maybe the government can't reach certain areas, or maybe there's lack of capacity. Well, that's where we have to partner. And I have to say we're finding some incredibly innovative ways of being able to reach populations in otherwise unreachable places through partners like the UN, which is incredible, or like NGOs. But working closely with the community is the most important to understand their needs. So I'm, on the one hand, incredibly alarmed because we didn't make enough progress. On the other hand, I'm opportunistic that we can make progress because of the new technologies, which are seeing the cost curve go down. And people are picking up doing it because it's quite autonomous. So I think there's a lot of opportunity there.
Yeah, thanks so much. Yeah, certainly a lot of opportunity from the technology. I mean, I think it's the World Bank's own assessment that to reach universal access, something like 50% of that lift comes from off-grid, particularly in rural places. And again, but there is still this sort of financing question. How do we work financing in a place where there's essentially an administrative vacuum or there's conflict? And maybe, Sergio, I could go to you. We talk all the time about how government financing will not be enough. I mean, the private sector needs to step in and provide the financial resources and the expertise that are important in these cases. I mean, we're here at the business pavilion in the COP, so I think mentioning the private sector is important. Innovative operators like Ignite can step in, but how does the IFC work to facilitate that kind of private sector activity and investment in these difficult environments?
No, thank you very much, Phil, and also a great pleasure and honor to be on this panel with such distinct panelists. But let me just build a bit on your question, in particular on the role of the private sector. I mean, I think we all realize that the needs are such. I mean, Anna, gave really, I think, all the data that we need to when we look at that problem, that public solutions will not be enough, right? But I think in today's world, we have to think a little bit beyond public on one side and private on the other. We have to think how we find combined solutions. Some of them public, some of them private, some of them a combination. And that's why we work, of course, very closely with the World Bank. I mean, we're part of the same group. We do this. We have the same mission. And trying to deploy innovative solutions where we leverage what the public can bring, we leverage what the private can bring. And I think that's where we can find a lot of ideas. I fully agree also with the argument, I mean, with the point made that new technologies offer us opportunities that we didn't have even 5 years ago or 10 years ago, right? And not only opportunities to have innovation, but also at scale. Because at the end, we have an issue of scale. And that has been probably one of the challenges in Africa. I cover Africa for IFC, so I'll talk a little bit more about Africa. But in Africa, as of today, we still have 46% of the population doesn't have access to electricity. So it's, as Anna was saying, it's not with conventional solutions that we're going to get there. But today, the models that we see are replicable and are scalable. And very often, I think you're right, it's issues around financing. So what we're trying to do is to not only use our own balance sheet and our financing capacity, but also mobilizing others and bringing partners who are ready to finance this type of project. So what we do, we spend quite a lot of our time at IFC doing what we call like preparing new projects, creating opportunities, creating new markets that don't necessarily exist, and making them more bankable so that then private sector can come and contribute to the financing. And that means a combination of course, looking on the technical side, working with the right operators, and I'm very glad that you're here, so that we can take some technological models and replicate them, but also working with the governments on the regulation side. And this is why we have so many programs, joint programs with the World Bank, where the World Bank does that part of the work, we do the other part on the private sector, and I think like this we can find solutions. And if I may add one point, which is particularly important in fragile countries, is that when we say that people don't have access to electricity, it doesn't mean that people live in the dark. It means that they go and they cut wood to get fire. It means that they get some generators and where they put diesel and very polluting systems, unsafe, polluting. And there's more more generator capacity in Africa today than solar and wind together, right? Because people turn to that as the only option that they have. We need to help them shift to something that is way more environmentally friendly and that is much more in the spirit of why we are all here at COP today.
Environmentally friendly and also affordable and also secure in terms of not being at the end of insecure fuel supply chains. Absolutely. Thank you so much, Sergio. Angela, let me go back to you. With all respect to the large institutions, we always hear a lot about working with partners to increase financing on the ground. But the numbers show that very little of that financing actually arrives there, particularly in these very difficult places. Can you tell us a little bit about your experience raising financing? What kind of models work, particularly in places where, Sergio and Anna both mentioned some of those challenges. I would add things like a sovereign rate ceiling, for example. I mean, very hard to get good price financing. What do you think works?
So I can't blame them in terms of the lack of financing for a simple reason, is I think a lot of the ways we thought about what we call distributed infrastructure, distributed electricity, distributed power, has been done through a model that was very hard to finance to date. That's why when we came to the market some 8 years ago or so, and we looked at it, and I come from an institutional finance world myself, and we looked at it, we thought that what we needed to do is to turn the market on its head and to change the business model of doing distributed power. From looking at it from, I would say, a pay-as-you-go model, or a model whereby there's a very high upfront costs and then very difficult to price credit risk at the other end, which limit the ability of institutional investors to come in at the right cost of capital that makes it affordable for the end client, and you get into that vicious circle. We had to recreate a new model. And to do that, and that was hard work, we had to go all the way from the top of the value chain, which is to work and us as a private company with government, with local government across Africa, to show them that this distributed power is not retail, it's electricity, it's infrastructure. To show them that we can become a rural utility using distributed technologies. And we work with them to create a model that we call today internally PPMP, which is private-public multilateral partnerships, whereby we go to the like of the World Bank and other development partners in Europe, in the US, and other places. We go to the governments, and when I say the government, it's not one person. Bear with me. It's the Ministry of Finance, it's the Ministry of ICT, it's the Ministry of the local communities that we deal with, the Ministry of Infrastructure that we deal with, and all of them, the mayors as well, all the way down, to explain them the potential for their people to do at very large scale distributed power. So we come like as a project developer, except that it's not like a multi-megawatt IPP. It is actually a distributed one, aggregating 300,000, 500,000 units, reaching millions of people in their country with, an aggregation of those units in the countries. So that was at the kind of, I would say, the industry innovation. The second level of innovation that we had to create is a very thorough suite of highly technologically advanced solutions that we build in-house around last mile operation. Because we needed to give them and to give all other partners transparency. Transparency of knowing exactly what's going on throughout the supply chain, at the end point of the clients, and being able to digitize the whole process from operation, from supply chain to operation to verification and visualization systems of what's going on in those deep rural areas where we operate, and the payment as well parts which we as well put together in order to really work with the client on digital payments only. So we created a whole suite of technology to make it fully transparent so that people can see directly the impact and know that what they are supporting is actually happening on the ground and is very transparent. So it's adding transparency to the system. And the last layers of innovation that we worked on over the years, and we're very happy to announce, it will be announced in a couple of days, but we've been talking about it at COP28 here, is a mechanism around innovative climate finance, which is about understanding that if you aggregate all those different units and the cash flows from those units that we're doing through SPVs in the countries where we operate, what you have today is a lumpy, sort of very hard to rate cash flow profile, which is hard to back by institutional debt or capital on the back. But we're developing now a guarantee mechanism with Convergence, which supported us. We got their award. It's the second award we got this week, which we're very happy about, to put together a very innovative blended finance solution for distributed infrastructure. And with that, we believe that with that innovative guarantee on end cash flows for the project, we'll be able to mobilize the right cost of capital of infrastructure player. A bit what happened to solar on-grid big solar and wind project maybe 15 years ago when I was looking at those projects where they had high double-digit yields, and that was totally non-affordable. And bringing it to become a new asset class that is properly backable with institutional capital in the right cost of capital for our financing partners, for a government partner, but most importantly as well for the recipient at the other hand, for whom we need to reach really deep profitability.
I wonder if Anna or Sergio, you have some response to that and how that sort of interfaces with some of your own blended finance programs and climate finance.
Well, first, I really want to agree with Angela that pricing in those markets is more expensive than elsewhere. And today, a citizen of a fragile country pays more for his or her electricity than anywhere else in the world, right? So I agree with you. We have to flip that equation and look at different solutions. And why is it more expensive? Because usually the scale is not always there. Technology is more expensive to get there. And then the risk, whether it's the country risk, the perceived risk, the broader risk is higher. So all these factors contribute to higher costs. So the approach that we took has been to say, well, we need, in order to really promote good solutions in those countries, we need to reduce the risk, we need to reduce the cost. And we've been using de-risking mechanisms. And so we call it like blended finance, meaning we bring some elements of subsidy to reduce the cost, reduce the risk. And that has allowed to go into markets where we couldn't go before. We've done it in Africa together with the World Bank and with MIGA, another sister institution of the World Bank Group, with a program called Scaling Solar, where we started in Zambia, then we went to Senegal, Côte d'Ivoire, Ethiopia, Niger, a number of countries in Africa, where with the right, I don't want to give too many details, with the right structure, right elements, it allowed to reduce the cost of the entire structure, which makes that at the end, the consumer, the citizen of this country, pays for his or her electricity at a much lower cost than before. And I think it's this type of innovation that we need to push forward. And then, again, push for scale, push for having something that is sizable so that we can support. And very interesting what you're explaining about the structure that you're developing. So I think this is exactly the right of models we need to support.
Great, thank you.
And I would just add that I think the most promising factor is having these cost curves being pushed down. So we see the cost per kilowatt hour keep going down, because I do think it's still too high for many households, businesses, public administrations in the developing world, particularly low-income countries. What the World Bank has for the low-income countries, which I think is helpful, is of course that we have IDA, our concessionary arm, which provides grant funds to many countries, particularly countries that are particularly poor, but also countries that have debt sustainability, debt restructuring processes going on. And we also have, of course, credits, which are very long-term financing. And I don't think there's absolutely any reason not to utilize these concessional financing for also energy access, for all the reasons that we've heard, because without energy you cannot expect businesses, you cannot provide the essential services that you need to provide in health, education, social services, and you cannot run government. So I think we have to see the cost curves come down, and in the meantime we have to make sure we provide really the concessionary financing to countries that need it the most.
Great, thanks so much. And I'm sort of struck also, I mean, I think about what the World Bank was doing with large off-grid providers, particularly during the COVID era, where there was a big shock to the system and actually underwriting a lot of the business model, which at the time was relatively shaky. And so there's another important part to step in. Speaking about resilience, we talked a little about financing and how we make this happen, but I want to go back also to the effects that these kind of services have. Gautam, I know that UNICEF, one of your big strategies or your big goals and ambitions is to improve the resilience of those services, of those basic services to children in particular, but to communities. What does that mean, and what does your framework look like to build those resilient services?
Thank you. And part of it also kind of gets back to, just struck by the conversations here about how pushing the cost curve down is an essential element of this. And perhaps also an important element is also raising our estimation of benefits. Because, I hate to say it, but if we are trying to move towards a world where we're looking for the lowest cost ways to decarbonize, it is unlikely that fragile context, distributed power, will be as competitive as large-scale decarbonization in middle-income countries, for example. But the benefits that accrue from decarbonization and from sustainable energy, decentralized solutions, go beyond the CO2 benefit or the mitigation benefit. They go into the benefits of resilient societies, of improved peace and security. And unless we find a better way of valuing those, and we're trying to do some of it, I think, including with the Economist, unless we find better ways of doing so, we are always going to be caught in a world where we're going to have to justify the competitiveness of this, where it's just blindingly obvious that a child in a society that has better access to health, to education, is a society that's more resilient to the impacts of climate change, a society that is more resilient to peace and security. But just to answer your direct question, when we see what we see, for example, we see communities such as and it's clearly not all done by UNICEF, when you see communities in Puerto Rico where after a storm, that the only health centers that are functioning are the ones with decentralized power. When you see that when it's in the Democratic Republic of Congo, in DRC, where we work, that in many of the areas where you have fuel shocks, the only places where you can have water that is accessible are those that are powered by decentralized pumps. In Yemen, where we work, some of the biggest solar desalination plant is in Ptolemais in Yemen, where it is one of the few ways that you can make sure that it isn't only about cost, it isn't only about but it's about the best way of delivering the benefit that you need.
Yeah. Well, Ala, maybe we can talk a little bit about that. I mean, specifically in these sort of Yemeni cases, what does it mean for a community to have these kind of resilient services? And I'm also eventually, interested in these questions about how does it change sort of those communities' sort of empowerment, the feeling of security, and eventually the broader sort of peace and security and stability environment as well.
Sure. So I've spoken a little bit about the health benefits and the education benefits. I mean, once the war started, around 50% of health facilities became dysfunctional, and so providing distributed kind of renewable energy has managed to bring back some of those facilities to be providing those services to society. But the other thing is, those kind of services provide a lifeline to some of the most fragile segments of society. So if we talk about IDPs, for example, those usually, the camps are set up in places that are even traditionally does not necessarily have the national grid. And those are very frail kind of communities that require really the basic services, and distributed solar have managed to provide them with access to clean water, with access to lighting, so that children can still manage to go to school and be able to contribute and not lose behind their peers, but also other services as well. So definitely it's solving a big issue that we are seeing in the country, and it's giving people hope that they are able to continue pace with their peers, and that they are not necessarily going to fall behind. A lot of Yemenis, and this is one of the interesting things, is the Yemeni society is very resilient, and I think that's not just a condition of Yemen. This is a lot of the FCV kind of societies are very resilient because of their how community is set up. So you would see entrepreneurship still being propagated even in the midst of those challenges that we are seeing in the midst of the lack of resources. What we have seen is young people trying to address, when the market is starting to collapse, they are trying to use ICT to be able to provide solutions and services to other regions. So having access to this limited kind of energy access still gives them these opportunities to be able to service markets that are beyond their means, and gives them abilities to be able to sustain themselves.
That's really well put. This is obviously something we work on in the Economist as well, is this idea of how young people and people that are in remote places can have vastly new opportunity on the back of some of these stacked services. Angela, I think about Ignite. At the heart of your model is the idea of stacking services and delivering them in sort of a stacked model. Maybe you could talk just a little bit about what you've seen as an experience about how those communities have changed, and maybe how those sort of new opening of, for example, economic opportunity, access to new markets, has changed communities that you've seen when you worked.
One point I think is important to raise, talking about community, and what we like to say that we innovate from the ground up, we're doing technology in the mud, right? Like we look first at what the communities need. We're not here we don't sell products, we provide solutions. And when we work with those communities, what they might need is, different size solars, different type of, appliances and solutions around them. So we check what they need, and then we develop the project. So we do residential, we do as well rural schools, rural healthcare for rural clinics that you have over there, as well as CNI for the places where needed. And that's just on the power side, right? Then we stack on it where it makes sense, solar irrigation system for the smallholder farmers where possible. In other parts, we've had project where we were able, which is always has some complexity attached to it, but we're able to provide a clean cooking facility as well. But the most important and very impactful thing that we're not bundling with the electricity, and we do that for the schools, thanks to as well, we're going to do that as well with the Zayed price, but not only, and for the clinics, is a bundle of power and internet. And if you look internally in our firm, like our North Stars, like every year, every quarter that we look at is how affordable can we get to the people, and we always innovate. I told you around like many different parts, from talking about carbon credit, which we leverage as well, talking with programs that we can work with partners, etc., to be able to provide this now internet plus power to the people. And there was a research that was done by a key academic institution, a global world academic institution, on our project. They spent like 6 months, like a very long time with us in the field. And they saw that just a matter of weeks, I'm not talking years, a matter of weeks of the kids in the home having access to power plus internet, their level of English skyrockets, their ability to like do online, we downloaded apps on the low-cost phone that they had, the ability to do like basic mathematics as well jump up massively. Ability for the family to have access to wellness information that are being provided on those portals coming from health partners and others is game changer. Talking about floods, talking about climate events that happens unfortunately in Africa, but we saw it in Rwanda recently where we operate. Ability to have like early warning systems whereby we can provide them with information of what's coming up and do the right thing will save lives. So having those two together is the amount of impact that is unlocked from having this bundle is absolutely like mind-blowing.
And I mean, how does that affect, for example, the community as a whole, and sort of their relationship, their autonomy, their feeling of sort of development and autonomy as a community vis-a-vis what might be a very scary and dangerous environment in which they're living?
It started from the Maslow pyramid, right? Like if you have all your basic needs, around safety, around health, etc., that are dealt with, you can start to elevate yourself, right? You can start to think about what more you can do with your time, with your knowledge, with the newly learned education that you just got, and so you have you elevate yourself socially as well as economically in terms of like becoming a much more active actor in your countries and your productive life, but as well maybe in your generally political life in your countries and everything. I think it's one of the AFDB president who said it a few years back. They say that we got to a point now if countries' leaders don't give power to their people, they will lose power. It's as well a way to see that these solutions are readily available to many. Why not me? Why not them? Right? So people will as well be aware that there is some solutions that could make their life better, and will start engaging in this way and wanting to have and work with leaders in their countries, with stakeholders in their countries that will be there to provide a solution. And that's one of the reasons why we engage with government as well. We want them to be part of the equation. We don't shy away from it because we do think we need to create this positive social interaction, political interaction in the country whereby leaders really care about their rural areas, about their people, and provide them with those solutions in a way that, okay, we operate, but here, you are as well a part of the equation, and you're part of giving those goods to your people.
Yeah, please, Anna.
Can I just
absolutely.
add 2 quick points on this? What we have found over the years is that the most sustainable development solutions are those that the community, has chosen among a number of different priorities, which is the major priority, and we hear over and over again water, energy, schools, because they care so much for their children, and of course health. Roads are up there too, but I think community sort of involved selection process, number one. Number two, an asset the community can actually take care of. And what's good about these low carbon solutions that we're seeing now is that they are autonomous in a way. They can be community based. 2, they're quick to install. 3, you don't have a whole lot of expenditure once it's up and running because you're not paying for the fuel for the diesel generators. And 3, they're safer. So I think there's just a whole lot to like about these new technologies that also fit very nicely into the lessons we've garnered over the years on what is sustainable development.
Yeah, and I really appreciate the point that came from both of you. I mean, essentially that having the buy-in from that community is key because you don't know what kind of existing either political structures or sort of service delivery structures you might be upsetting otherwise. Sergio, when we're talking about the effects of these kinds of services, how does this sort of catalyze private sector growth? So when we're talking about fragile states in particular, what is the pathway by which ideally wider private sector growth can be catalyzed?
Well, I think when you have, once you have a reliable and a safe and affordable access to energy, then a lot of economic activity gets developed. And I'm like thinking because there's a company that we've worked with that has a similar model to yours. Started with setting up like small units, like built around the container, just with some solar panels and to provide electricity for people just around it. And then when they were talking with the community on how to install it and how to develop this model, the community said, well, what actually they needed is that, but then they needed also sort of to make it like a business center, right? So we provided some advisory service, some technical assistance, so that people could go there and not only would charge their phone and they would charge their devices, but then they would sort of learn on how to use this as a source of a productive activity. So you could see trade starting to go on. That's why I find it's very interesting that you do that also with the internet, delivery of internet with electricity, because that's what it needed, and particularly in Africa where the population is so young, where you need to create jobs. That's the jobs of the future. So that I think there's a strong correlation with economic activity, and with, of course, with that in an environment of fragility that also creates. There's a link with creating peace and creating social cohesion, and I think that's very important in terms of improving the stability in those countries.
Fabulous. Thanks so much. I kind of want to take advantage of the fact that we have this, let's say, relatively intimate space to bring in sort of voices in the audience. So please, if anybody has any questions or would like to maybe make any interventions along this path. I know, Joelle, we have at least one.
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity. My name is Joelle Hangi. I'm joining from UNITAR GPA. And we focus on access to energy and displacement settings mostly. And then it was really so powerful to hear from all of you and how you are really approaching the issue of energy transition, especially in fragile contexts. And speaking of the buy-in from the community, this is one of the really key. Speaking from my own experience, I'm a refugee myself, and I know what it feels, what it means to have a product that was developed somewhere, and then you just get the product, and you really don't know how to interact even with it. It's really I think that connecting with the project or connecting the product is one of the key elements when it comes to addressing the energy need of the displaced people. But also aside from that, speaking of having displaced people or the community itself part of this project's development is one of the things that we recently talked about the inclusion of the displaced people themselves into addressing the energy need of their community, because they're the one really bearing the amount of let's say damage, and it's really affecting their lives currently and shaping their future in a unfortunately negative way, and it's really important to start redefining how we approach them, how we talk to them, how we consider them, because of course they're assets, they have contributions, but if we still continue with that traditional way of doing the usual business, like they're just a recipient of aid, then they will sit and then they will just wait for the aid, which will not last, and there is no guarantee. So we'll keep will remain in that circle of giving aid, and there is no way to cut that aid, and it's really very problematic at the moment. We know that what the world is currently facing is another level, and we need to act collaboratively. So it's really important to mention that I think displaced people, refugees, IDPs, they also have a key role when it comes to addressing the energy needs of themselves, but also the surrounding community. So it's really important to change to more innovative way of working with them and considering them as contributors to the solution, not just a recipient of aid, really. Thank you.
Can I just make one quick comment to what you said, because I think you touched on a very important point. Sorry. One, I mean, when we look at fragility, and this is a common theme that we have with the World Bank, and we have a strategy on how we address issues on fragility. One of the dimensions is the situation of refugees, which is a question that impacts a lot of fragile countries. And on the IFC side, we've set up an initiative with the UNHCR a few years ago. And at the beginning, people were saying, why is private sector looking into that? But what we did is we started by doing a study on one camp in Kakuma in Kenya, and we realized that actually, in terms of economic center, after Nairobi, this is the second largest economic center of the country, right? And what we did is we looked at it with an angle of how do we help create employment, create real activity, create livelihoods, and not just, as you were saying, delivering aid. And so we started by a study, and then we did a second initiative where we launched a program where we actually giving some funding to companies, particularly founded by young entrepreneurs, women and men, in the camp and in the hosting community, because it's important that we integrate both. And that has contributed to create an economic activity and help improve the situation of the people both in the community, in the hosting community, and in the camp. So I think it's a very important part of Fragility, and we're trying to address it the best we can.
Anyone else? Oh, sorry, Gautam, please, if you'd like to.
No, you go first.
Actually, you might help me answer. So I'm Steve Cornish from Doctors Without Borders, and we're familiar with this experience in Kakuma camp and have spoken with some of the providers and really thrilled with the advances in technology and new partnerships and leveraging. And we're wondering how we can get to the next step in the most fragile and in the conflict affected in real time when refugee camps are being built. Because that's one of the things that falls through the cracks is fuel. And we know how many other things are linked to it, from respiratory disease to SGBV issues, local deforestation, problem with host communities. And I was in Sudan about a year and a half ago, or 2 years now, trying to set up refugee camps for those coming from Ethiopia. And the communities wanted to welcome the refugees, but they're like, we don't want to give you any more land because 30 years ago, your parents came here, and then they left the whole area deforested. And now we are sitting in Chad with 500,000 refugees. There isn't enough food, there isn't enough water, but we know we're going to end up in the same problem with host community, with local deforestation. And how do we bring some of these technologies, some of this new finances to be able to work in the most fragile and most climate affected areas? That would be my question.
Please, Anna.
I just have to take this one. First of all, to say thank you to Doctors Without Borders. You do amazing work, and my colleague Zainabu and I saw it firsthand when we were in Adre, Chad, on the border of Sudan and Chad just a few months ago, and just wanted to say that. And secondly, reflect on your question of how do you bring technologies to the situations where refugees come and where you also have host communities that actually are usually very poor, because many of the places refugees are coming to are usually borders, lagging regions. So you have this very difficult situation of an influx of people who need food, water, services, shelter, care, but you also have a community that has very little to begin with, and it's very, very difficult. And I have to say, I was going to mention it here, I will mention it now. When we left Adre, it was actually very sad to leave because it was becoming night and it was dark. And we don't know here our lives. Some of you will know where you came from, but the terrifying feeling of darkness for maybe 12 hours, 14 hours until the light comes, the natural light comes. The whole area was dark. But coming back to your question, but it made me go back to my office and say, I have to double down on this. We cannot have people living in darkness, right? So it's important when you're working in the work we work in to see it and keep coming back to it, which is why we have to double down. But I think the answer really is where Sergio was going, which is we need solutions that address the host community and the refugees. A refugee stays for a long time. So we also need to remember that these communities change when refugees come. And we also need to remember that many refugees actually are also very talented. When we met with women who had come over from Sudan, they said, we want to work. We want to use our skills. We're looking to be helpful. And some of them were healthcare workers. They ended up working in some of the clinics that had been set up. But what it means for us as a development institution is that we need to think about much more local economic development projects where we can finance basic service delivery in terms of small-scale infrastructure, but also job-creating activities. And this is where I think partnering with IFC, partnering with others is so important. And what I really loved about this visit is that we did it together with UNHCR. So the UNHCR team was very much focused on humanitarian. We were starting to think, what does local economic development look like? How do we make sure we provide, there were very few schools in Adre, even before the refugees came, or clinics so far away. We said, why don't we, the World Bank, finance schools and hospitals or clinics more? Because they are also left behind. This is now investing in this community. So this ability to think humanitarian, focus on humanitarian, development, focus on development, but in the end, you're serving the region and you're serving the influx of people who need the services, who we know may not stay a very short time, may actually stay a longer time. So thank you.
If I can just say a comment on that is, so we've trained over the years, we're present in 10 countries, we train over the years over 3,000 people. 99% of our people are actually local people, very often coming from the rural areas that we serve. As we go into those places, they see how advantageous those systems are and those solutions are, and they want to become ourselves. And guess what? Very often the person that is benefiting the most, first and foremost from that, are actually the women and the kids, because they were the one getting as well impacted from using candles or burning fuel of wood or other things. And so we end up training and employing a lot of women in the rural areas that are becoming our agents and doing those stuff. And we've explored, we haven't worked yet with refugees, but we've explored it over the last maybe 5 or 6 years. I come again from a part of the world that is very much impacted by those issues. We would love to do things in Sudan, and we were already doing some business development, and then the war exploded, so I guess this is even more needed now that there's the war. We've looked at part of Iraq. We've looked at different parts in the world of, you see, refugees as well out of Syria and this different part. We'd love to find a way to do it. We've never really got the chance, I guess, to have the right round table with the right partners at our level, actually, to get things done. But this is something that is extremely important, and the only way to make it happen is by training the local people to become fully involved into the solutions and into the commercial aspect of it, or into the operational, I would say, aspect to it.
For the maintenance and sustainability. Gaza?
Just one on that, and on the point that you made. I mean, it's a bit tragic sometimes, but sometimes we've found it in refugee camp settings to make an easier case for distributed energy and for solar, because we can claim with the host government that this is not permanent infrastructure.
Yeah,
and which, right? But I, on a separate question, and I'm sorry, Phillip, I think you were going to perhaps ask this. So, but why? But if we're talking about, look, the technology is getting better, we have business models, we have all of this stuff, it's all coming together. Then why have we not done better than we are doing? And I mean, because in this group here, you would think that you have policymakers who see the light, you have extremely talented operators, you have people who provide finance, and you have organizations that work at the community level and can generate a pipeline of projects, work on sustainability. Just from our side, we see a few things. One is that there's still too much of this division between what's known as humanitarian finance and development finance. It's just easier for us sometimes, or more difficult for us, to make the case for sustainable energy, which has a higher capex up front and a lower opex, because that's not the way the humanitarian budgets work. But then the other is that shining the light upon ourselves too, is we should, for us, and that's something that I know us and other development institutions are also looking at, is up to now we haven't sufficiently prioritized or sustainability of systems. We prioritize putting panels on roofs and commissioning plants, but not the long-term benefit that has versus I mean, we know what the story looks like, where there are so many health centers in Africa where you go, it's been 4 different sets of panels put in by 4 different sets of donors, none of them work. Because because the incentives are wrong.
Which speaks, I think, to exactly the same point. Community buy-in, the sustainability of being involved in operations and maintenance, and also having sort of a long-term plan for keeping these things going. It's really good. We're running out of time, which is such a shame, because this is such a great conversation. I mean, clearly continues to go in an important direction. But first, I just would really like to thank the panel for joining me. So from over here, Ala, Angela, Anna, Gautam, and Sergio, thanks so much for joining this panel with us and with Economist Impact. Gautam mentioned some of the work we're doing with UNICEF precisely on how energy brings sustainability and resilience to cities. So we'll be coming out with that soon, and welcome everybody to stay tuned for that. Stay tuned with our sustainability project. And other than that, all I have to say is, there's a reception after this with the We Mean Business Coalition that everyone's invited to join, those of us that don't have next thing to go to. So please join us and we can continue the conversation in a more friendly and liquid way. Thank you.